every day more evidence of the atrocities comes out, the more videos and photographs of really beautiful, beautiful young people who we know were brutalized and murdered and slaughtered. And those who did put their bodies around them and tried to protect them. And then our question of what happens to a person's humanity where none of this is taken seriously, with just a devotion to murder and slaughter others. And we can talk about that tonight. And of course, the line where it says, to dare to love deeply. I want to get this exactly right. To dare to love deeply and risk everything for the good thing. And I think that's something that we have to discuss, is what we emphatically mean by the good thing. And the problem is that one problem is that those who are ideologically committed, and sometimes ideologically committed to evil ideas, have a very clear sense of what the good thing is, which oftentimes involves the murder of other people or the repression of any contrary ideas. And those who are not ideologically and repressively inclined have a tough time discussing what the good thing is. One thing I would hope that one thing that comes out of this is for us to understand, to risk everything for the good thing, and for our mind what the good thing is and what we need to do to protect it. I've been working on my own adaptation of the in English of the El Milei Rachamim, and I've combined parts that are the prayer for the departed in general, of loved ones, of the martyrs of the Shoah. And I'm not calling what happened here martyrs, because this really fits no sense of martyrdom where anybody was given the choice to die for their faith or not. This was simply a slaughter. And also evolving the prayer for protection, protection of civilians, and of course protection of those who are willfully putting their lives in harm's way to protect the civilians. So this is an evolving meditation that I just want to share with you at the outset. O God of compassion, who dwells on high, grant perfect rest under the wings of your Shekhinah to those who perished in the terror attacks on Shmini Atzeret and soon thereafter, the murdered, slaughtered, shot, mutilated, burnt and tortured innocents, families, women, men, young and elderly, and children, and to the soldiers, police officers, firefighters, rescue teams, and civilians who fought, with or without weapons, who held the line, who turned back the attacks, and gave their lives to protect others. May all of their memories be for a blessing, and may their memories inspire us to hold each other dearly, to protect each other, to eradicate this evil and all evil from the face of the earth. May God protect all those fighting in the Israel Defense Forces to defeat Hamas, and all of Israel's other police and security services, as well as the military and security personnel of the United States, soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen, and all others serving in the theater of operations to contain and defeat this evil. May God bring them all in safety and security back to their homes and loved ones. As for our talk tonight, I have a few things I want to say at the outset. And remember, based on a conversation that we had very early after the terrorist attacks, we talked with a highly placed officer in the intelligence establishment. Remember, one of our daughter Shuli used to serve in intelligence when she was in the Army from 2012 to 2015. By the way, she returned to Israel yesterday to go back and do her part. Avi Gal is there doing her part. I want to talk about the Israeli civilian response that includes our daughters, Mirav's family, and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are determined to support each other, to protect each other, and to protect the state of Israel and defeat this evil. So here's a few things that I wanted to share. I just want to remind you that, so what is the main thing that this person has told us is our work against misinformation and disinformation. Many of you find yourselves in conversations. You're not exactly sure what to say. You're not exactly what approach to say. But we need to do this with people that we know, our neighbors, our coworkers, extended family, This is especially important for anyone in college, high school, even elementary school. We've heard reports of the so-called Free Palestine demonstration in elementary schools where children are being indoctrinated. I made the metaphor of the Hitler Youth. They're being indoctrinated into hatred at a very young age without even knowing it, because they don't know that Free Palestine is a code word for murder Jews, Israeli Jews in particular, but Jews everywhere if you look at the Hamas charter. So here's one thing I want to say at the outset. I'm going to call the argument of fair treatment for Palestinians. Sometimes when people bring things up, for example, the division of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, and Israel's security restrictions and so forth, people bring that up. And my first question, remember, always your first question, first of all, do you recognize Israel's right to exist behind safe and secure borders? If they say no, realize that behind everything that they're saying is the destruction of the state of Israel and the annihilation of Israeli Jews. Now, if they say, I do support Israel's right to exist, then oftentimes what's happening is people have heard the occupation is unfair, Israel is stealing the land of Palestinians on the West Bank, Israel is an apartheid state, the so-called blockade. They bring up a series of other things, which I'm willing to address, because some things, there sometimes is unfair treatment, and when we see it, we have to admit it. And Israel has many nonprofit groups are always vigilant for unfair treatment of Palestinians on the West Bank, and very careful prior to the real blockade, the siege now, to make sure, depending on the circumstances, that humanitarian goods found their way into the Gaza Strip. So those are two different conversations. One is discuss the fair treatment of Palestinians, and the second is to point out faults in Israel as a surreptitious way to undermine Israel's right to exist. So always make that clear. And then whenever someone brings something up, the second strategy I recommend for all of you, always ask people to define their terms. I just want to give you one very brief example. A person made the claim to me that Israel's an apartheid state. I said, okay, can you give me an example? And they said the Israeli school system is segregated. I said, actually, it's not. Jews and Arabs can go to any school they want, in reasonable distance. The thing is that most Arabs prefer to go to an Arab language school in their villages. Can Arabs move to Tel Aviv? Yes. In Meirav's parents' condominium building in Cholon, there are many Arab families there. There are Arabs in the high school. Remember, there are Druze, Bedouin, Christians, and Muslim, we might call Arabs, which itself is a difficult term, because if we mean descendants of people from the Arabian Peninsula, meaning ethnically Arab, there are actually not that many Arabs in Palestine. I'll say Muslim Palestine, because if you look at the history of demographics of the Palestine, there are huge immigration movements from around Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, etc., as well as North Africa, in particular Egypt, Algeria, and so forth. So if we did a DNA analysis of the residents of Palestine, relatively, a minority are actually from the Arabian Peninsula. So when someone says Arab, it might just be well to take a moment and say, what exactly do you mean by Arab? Do you mean a Muslim who speaks Arabic? Well, interestingly, that's a huge debate in the Muslim world, who actually counts as an Arab. Now, that's a little bit too nuanced a conversation to have, but I just want you to know that the more I study this, the more questions people have of what exactly counts as Arab. Does it mean a Muslim who speaks Arabic? Which is a fair definition, by the way. I'm not against the definition. But if there's a claim of a continuing ethnic presence in the area called Palestine, that's a question. Now, I want to remind you why. Palestine used to be called Judea. It was renamed by the Romans in the 2nd century CE, purposefully to eradicate any memory of the Judeans, the Jews who lived there, and it became part of what was called the Roman Empire, and then the East Roman Empire, the capital in Constantinople. Now, we oftentimes call that the Byzantine Empire for convenience, although that term was not used until after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, when it was taken over by the Ottoman Turks. So, but we're going to use the term Byzantine Empire, so we won't confuse that with the Roman Empire, where the capital was Rome, but rather the Byzantine Christian Empire, where the capital was Constantinople. I want you to think about this for a moment. The region called Palestine, it's not a state, it's a region, was Christian. And people spoke Greek and Aramaic, as we see in the New Testament. The New Testament never mentions Palestine. So when did Christian, Greek, Latin, Aramaic speaking Palestine become Arabic speaking and Muslim? Well, it was conquered by invading forces from the Arabian Peninsula. And I remember one particularly surprisingly fair conversation I had with someone, because when I asked them to define imperialism, and they said when one group takes over another group, and part of it is to eradicate their religion and eradicate their language and force them to be part of the empire, I brought this up and I said, would you consider that colonialism and imperialism? The person says, absolutely. I was rather surprised, because most people, when you actually bring up an example such as the expansion of the empire that came out of the Arabian Peninsula and Damascus, the so-called Syrian Arab Empire, most people won't consider that to be imperialism and colonialism, because it doesn't meet the current political definitions of the term, not historical definitions of the term, political definitions of the term. Just giving this as an example. If someone says apartheid state, I say, what exactly do you mean? If they say blockade, what exactly do they mean? If they say Palestine, I say, what exactly do you mean? And here's one thing you'll discover. People are just incorrigibly cloudy about what these terms mean, which is not uncommon, that two people will use the same word, but mean entirely different things. So I want to encourage you, when you talk to anybody, that you understand the range of meanings of these words, what the words actually denote, meaning do they actually denote something historical, what they connote as an idea, what they symbolize, and so forth. Now, I want to talk about this extensively, because when you discuss with your friends, neighbors, especially college-age, high school-age, elementary-age children, you have to equip them with enough of an intellectual rooting in truth. Now, I am saying truth. I don't believe everybody has their own truth. I'm not a moral relativist, which means when I tell you the history of the region called Palestine, there's abundant evidence backing me up, to the point that when you start to look at what I'm going to call relatively Palestinian, meaning the Arabs of Palestine-oriented sources, they now have to include this because the evidence is so widespread among scholars. So I will only share with you things that I know to be historically true from the perspective of the study of history in a reasonably unbiased way. If I have a theory about something, I'll tell you it's a theory. If I have an opinion about something, I'll tell you that's an opinion. But we all have to be rooted in facts. Now, with that, just a few things, and then I'll take any questions, and then a couple things I want to talk about tonight and tomorrow. So first of all, the purpose of the attacks is becoming more and more clear. The purpose of the attack was to kill Jews. Now, this is hard for us to think, because most of us don't think that way. But when you look at the Nazis, the purpose of the Holocaust was to kill Jews. Sometimes people try to look for some kind of economic military reason. There was no economic military reason. If you look at the Nazi attack into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, a very big part of that was to murder Slavs. Hitler made this very clear in his Mein Kampf, his struggle, which was to depopulate the East and move in Germans to take the place of the exterminated populations. He was very clear. There are groups that aim toward extermination. Hamas is one of them. A second thing was to simply damage Israel's reputation as a strong state, which would encourage Israel's opponents, especially on the West Bank. And something that Hamas actually advocated, remember, was an uprising among Israeli Arabs, Palestinians on the West Bank, being attacked by Hezbollah, by Syria, even Jordan. They asked Iraq to join in the attack. And I'm not sure if any Iranian missiles could get that far, they're being intercepted. But Hamas really wanted there to be an uprising, which have been catastrophic for Israel, catastrophic for the region, and would have involved hundreds of thousands of casualties, maybe even deaths. But that's not Hamas's concern, because they want to murder Israelis, and as you know, the deaths of their own civilians don't matter to them. And there's plenty of evidence for that, and I'll talk about that. So there are many motivations behind it, but we know from the training manuals they left behind, we know from the maps they left behind, we know from the GoPro videos that they left behind, we know from all kinds of other documentary evidence, including witness statement, the intent was not just to murder, but to commit atrocities, to slaughter people, to slit people's throats, to burn bodies, to behead infants, and so forth. That was part of the plan. It's hard for me to say it. There are videos that I've seen that I really would not share with anybody, but the documentary evidence is out there. Now, second thing of concern is the systemic failure in the Israeli, I'm going to say mostly the intelligence services. The head of Israeli military intelligence has said, "It's my fault. I take full responsibility." The chief of staff of the Israeli army has says, "I take full responsibility for the unpreparedness of the military." The head of the Israeli FBI, meaning internal security, the General Security Services, has said, "I take full responsibility." Many people then question, well, what about Netanyahu? Now, that's an interesting thing. I'll just give you two examples from American history. After Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt did not resign. The other most notable devastating military failure in American history, most of you probably don't know about this, was the Chinese entry into the Korean War in October, November, December 1950, which was a complete intelligence failure on the part of the Americans and led to tens of thousands of unnecessary casualties in the American forces, South Korean forces, and of course among Korean civilians. Harry Truman did not resign. Douglas MacArthur ended up resigning. So the question is, should the head of government resign when there's a failure in the military and defense establishment? Here's what I've seen from my reading. Those who already hate Netanyahu say Netanyahu should resign. I haven't seen anybody change their opinion. Those who are pro-Netanyahu say Netanyahu shouldn't resign. He's the head of government. He's the elected leader. Have another election and let decide. Remember, I'm not pro or anti-Netanyahu. During the protest issues, I was just interested in fairness, the study of law, and Jewish ethics of discourse. I don't think I said anything pro or against any side in general, other than my particular expertises. One is the study of law, and I discovered that during all this time, the actual facts of the judicial reform weren't well understood. And secondly, the constant violation of the ethics of Jewish discourse. So I want to make it very emphatically clear. Some people thought because I didn't critique Netanyahu that I'm pro-Netanyahu. I'm not pro either side, because that's not my area of concern. I'm not Israeli. I don't vote there. So that's actually beyond my area of concern. And so we're learning more about the systemic failure. The systemic failure actually went down to people at the outpost overlooking Gaza who reported unusual activity, and the local intelligence officer told them to forget about it. There are Israeli civilians who had their own amateur listening devices, and they reported to the Israeli intelligence service. This is someone on the border, on one of the kibbutzim, who reported what was going on. They took away his license and confiscated his equipment. Okay? Now, so the intelligence failure isn't simply at the head of the chief of staff, the head of military intelligence, the head of the general security services. It goes all the way down to the operational level, on the border and behind the border. I'm aghast when I read these things, and I don't know how to account for it. Mirav and I are in constant grieving, because had one intelligence officer pushed the button the day before when people knew, but no one hit the alarm, and every level it went up, the person said, ignore it. So there's a chain of systemic failures from the top to the bottom to the top, side to side. I don't understand it. There will be an investigation later. I keep saying to people right now, let the government govern, let the military organize itself, let the intelligence services get back to work, and we'll figure out whom we're going to blame and hold responsible later. That's my position. You don't have to agree with me. That is simply, of course, an opinion. Now, what about the world response? I have to share with you, I was extremely impressed with President Biden. especially as he has clearly been brought to understand, as I shared with you, the briefings that I attended right after this, where I was informed by highly placed Israeli and American diplomats that this is a part of a larger struggle of an axis of evil of Russia, China, Iran, and others wanting to embarrass the United States and push what I'm going to call a repressive, anti-human rights orientation against the United States, Europe, and Israel. So not only is this really a war for the survival, the safety of Israelis, in particular Israeli Jews, it is part of a global struggle that is fought not only through in terrorism against terror states, but also a war of ideas that support terrorism and terror states, which is actually my concern because that's the fight that we can fight. So the European Union, by the way, voted an overwhelmingly, I think it was 570 to 22, to condemn Hamas and be in favor of Israel. I was astonished by that. The UN has not done so. I've gone actually and looked at the minutes of UN meetings of the Human Rights Council. It's just absurd because when you look at the Human Rights Council, who gets the floor? Russia, China, Iran, various other Muslim states, a few others, and you read it, and it's just a charade imitating a committee. There's actually nothing serious happening there. It's all posturing. So that's when some people were asked, well, what, really ignore the United Nations? I don't want to ignore the United Nations for any good that they do. But remember, I have a theory of the good. I have the theory of the morally indifferent, which means something that's not moral. And I have a theory of bad to evil. A lot of what happens at the UN around Israel is bad to evil. And you want to look at those records, you can look at themselves and you'll see exactly what I'm saying. A few things, the Israeli response. First of all, the continuous aerial bombardment. There's been many questions about the Gaza civilians and the war crimes. In one of my emails, I listed to you what war crimes are. One of them is, if you can justify an attack where civilians are killed, that is a legitimate military objective, and the enemy is purposefully putting their military installations in civilian neighborhoods, it is not a war crime. It doesn't matter what anybody says. You can look on the UN definition of a war crime. Israel is not committing war crimes. You can't trust what the UN says because if you look at the minutes of UN meetings, they're entirely biased against Israel. I just looked at the UN definition of war crimes. I looked at what Israel is doing. They don't qualify as war crimes. I listed that, and you can go look it up yourself. However, placing issues of anything of military value in civilian neighborhoods is a war crime, but you'll never hear Hamas being accused of a war crime by the UN because of the way the UN is constructed. I'll say further than that. Hamas has been launching rockets randomly, indiscriminately into Israel since 2005, especially since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007. There's a kind of a game that goes on. Israel apparently commits some kind of offense. They launch rockets. It gets to the point where Israel has an incursion. The world yells ceasefire. Israel pulls out, and Hamas just does it again. What you see happening now is Hamas stepped over the line, and it's not just one of the game of rocket attacks, incursion, ceasefire, move on. The rules of that are over. There's something else going on. But what I ask people is shooting hundreds and thousands of rockets into civilian areas a war crime? Now, by any definition, it is a war crime. Has it ever been described as a war crime by the United Nations? Never. Now, that's for my prima facie evidence that whenever someone says war crime, either they don't know what war crimes are, or they're just following either the line of the UN and I'll say Israel's other adversaries, or they're running on compassion. Now, I want to remind you all, this is very important as you conduct these discussions. Morality is maybe alerted by compassion, but is not the same as compassion. It's very important. Here's an example I gave up to our Hebrew school children. I know of a person who's sitting in a dark and dank room, can't get out, on a very, very poor diet, and sees very little sunlight, maybe an hour a day. Should we rescue the person? And my 7th grade students said, well, obviously. I said, however, they're sitting in a federal prison for an act of terrorism or some kind of other serial murder or something. Now what do we do? They're in a maximum security prison, let's say on Terminal Island. Should we all go bust into Terminal Island and get this murderer out? So therefore, suffering does not mean illegitimate. So whenever I see the terrible pictures of Gazan suffering, remember, they're framed for propaganda. I'm not saying there isn't suffering, but if you look at the frame, for example, when it says Israel's bombing the south, if you look for a wide picture, there are a few structures being bombed. In the north, there are places being devastated because they're covering tunnels. But when you look at the Gaza civilians, here's a caption I would like. Again, this is going to be more of an opinion and maybe a little bit hard-hearted. I would like the caption to say, photo of a person suffering because of the disastrous war that their government began, and then ask the person suffering, can I interview you? Yes. Were you cheering when mutilated bodies were thrown in the back of pickup trucks and paraded through Gaza? Were you cheering? Now, we don't know of any opposition to Hamas policies in Gaza. I haven't heard of any demonstrations against what they did. Some people have said Gaza's civilians are completely complicit. They completely supported what Hamas did. I don't know. There's no evidence that they opposed it. Now, that doesn't justify killing anybody, but for me, the compassion factor goes down. The compassion factor goes down when people have brought on a war themselves and then object when the other side fights back. So I don't think there are war crimes. I certainly have sympathy for all human suffering, but it's not equivalent. An intentional attack to murder civilians is a completely different moral category in a war to destroy the regime that began the war and committed the atrocities. Now, this is a little bit too nuanced for most people. They see a photograph and they say war crimes and suffering Gazans. It's an emotional response. It's not a moral response. It's an emotional response. It's one of sympathy. If you're going to talk to such a person, you just have to sit down and say, can I have 5 minutes of your time? Can we discuss what a war crime is? I sent it in the email. I provided links. See if you can have a discussion. Is there a difference between the suffering of people who launched the war versus those who are after to defeat the evil? Is there a moral difference? If they say, no, there's no moral difference, well, the discussion is over. But there might be people who'll understand it. Another thing I want to say here, I'm not talking about the aerial bombing of Gaza, that it clearly produces suffering and destruction. I think it's justified. I don't think it's war crimes. Now, the question of the ground invasion, it hasn't happened. We know there are different reports that a few 100,000 people have been called up. They're probably all around the country, mostly in the northern border and the southern border. We don't know what number of those people are actually trained combat troops to invade Gaza and destroy Hamas. There's no intention to reconquer, but rather to destroy the enemy. I think, along with other interested parties, to create a government that will not allow Hamas to come back and then Israel to pull its soldiers out. The Israeli government has said this might take months, maybe even a year. The Israeli populace has said we have to. No one has heard that and said, well, then don't defeat Hamas. There's an understanding that this or worse will happen if Hamas is not defeated, and therefore this is a war that has to be won. I'm just going to give the analogy of our attacking Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Second World War. Clearly the casualties were mounting and they were very distressing, but there wasn't at any point where Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman said, we're just going to stop the war. Right? We had to win that war. So if you know American history, this is that kind of war. This is that kind of war. Let's see. Last couple of issues, I'll take questions, then I'll see if I have time for my point tonight. And that is the very nuanced distinction that I'm going to call between, you can either call it the political left or the old left, and the ideological left or the new left. They're two very different things. American Jews who are on the left are typically and this is just my term to make a distinction. The political left means focus on civil rights often, focus on benefiting the working class, focusing on immigrant rights, focusing on unfair police practices. So there's a sense of social justice the purview of social justice being expanded. I'm going to call that the political left. Sometimes people call it the old left, but everybody remembers the old left is long gone. But that's where I was brought up. I was brought in what I would call a very strong political left home. I think most of my values still align with what I would call the political left. My only question is how to achieve those values. Now, the so-called new left has almost nothing to do with the political left. I want to give you an example. When Black Lives Matter came into being, I was waiting for actions that would show that Black Lives Matter, which means amelioration of conditions in Black neighborhoods, amelioration of the poor performance of Blacks in education, whoever's at fault, meaning Black Lives Matter. If you remember, it was almost entirely against so-called systemic racism, which was blaming white people. Now, I'm not saying I don't think there is systemic racism, but let's be agnostic about that for a moment. And I'm not saying white people are to blame. But when you look at what actually happened with Black Lives Matter, it wasn't what I'm going to call the political left, which is let's find out why Blacks perform relatively poorly in academics. If some Black schools are in greater states of disrepair than a white school in a given neighborhood, those are all what I would call things of the political left. If you look at the ideological left, they don't care about that. If you look at their greatest focus, it is anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism, and when they say free Palestine from the sea to the Jordan River, free Palestine means the eradication of Israel. It's a code word. And remember, how do I find out? When a person says free Palestine, I say, what exactly do you mean? If they say some fair two-state solution, I say, great, let's talk. If by free Palestine they mean free Palestine of Jews, then we're talking about genocide. And I have to know what they mean. And here's what I found out. Many people don't know what they mean. It's just a great slogan. I mean, who's not in favor of freedom? Who doesn't feel sorry for Palestinians? I feel sorry for Palestinians, and I'm in favor of freedom. Should I go out and shout free Palestine? I probably shouldn't, because those who are introducing the term, because of their ideological connection to anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, the hijacking of critical theory, all things I want to explain in detail as time goes on, they don't mean give a break to the working person. It's not about civil rights. It's not about democracy. Here's my evidence. Look at Gaza. Are there gay rights in Gaza? Is there democracy in Gaza? Is there a rule of law in Gaza? Are there fair courts in Gaza? Is there a free press in Gaza? Are there any protections of free speech in Gaza? Is there anything in Gaza that faintly resembles the concerns of what I'm going to call the political left? Now, when people are challenged, if some person favors the agenda of the political left, say, would you want to live in Gaza? They say, that's not the point. We want to ameliorate the suffering. I say, okay. But at least admit, what's happening in Gaza does not in any way accord with the concerns of what I call the political left. It concurs with the concerns of that. I don't think we should call them the hard left anymore, because it's an insult to what I'm going to call the political left, which I admire and sometimes see myself as a part of. It's an ideology that is committed in many ways to the destruction of the state of Israel. And if you look in the fine print, it's an attack on Western civilization and an attack on the United States and free Europe. But you got to really dig deep, and the more you dig, the more you'll see that this is true.